Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining this event from Toronto in Canada. And this will be a small snippet from a longer paper that's coming out in March in a special Crib Time issue of the journal South Atlantic Quarterly. And in this paper, I'm reading the memoir and life writing of autistic trans writers, people who are both autistic and trans, to explore how the temporality of their narratives may offer a way out of some of the traps that trans life falls into in transnormative times. And I realize that trans people and trans women in particular are under attack in the UK right now. And so this might not actually fit your context. This was written in the Canadian context where trans rights are currently quite formalized and somewhat protected on the national level, national, local, and provincial levels. And yet where it's become clear that only particular ways of being trans can be welcomed and folded into the state. And so that might indeed be preferable to outright attacks that the UK is seeing right now. But it comes with its own set of problems that require analysis. So before I begin, Go writes that in our current context, non-autistic people become authorized as autism somethings. So autism researchers, autism experts, autism parents. And I want to clarify that that I'm not an autism anything. So I'm a trans academic, non-autistic, and I came by my interest in autistic trans narratives by way of my research about trans youth futures. So this slide has an image of a typewriter on it. So while autism, transgender are highly medicalized states of being, both of them, there is no biological marker that distinguishes autistic from non-autistic minds or trans from cis ones. And so what I mean is there's no physiological test that would determine that one is either trans or autistic. So the test could be said to be the story that you tell. And Duffrey and Dorner call that a narrative condition. So in the sense of coming into being as it is storied over time. And within the past decade, the autistic trans overlap known at the community level has been confirmed by research findings that autistic children are about 7 times more likely to be gender variant and vice versa. So research perseverates on insulting questions of etiology on the neurological whyness of an autistic trans overlap, with some researchers suggesting that trans and autism are, quote, co-occurring disorders, or that gender variance is an autistic, quote, obsessive compulsive disorder. And it should hardly need saying that these insulting theories entirely miss the plot of autism as a neurology of a queer nature. And I'd like to suggest that while the scientific gaze is trained elsewhere, we might find within the narratives of autistic trans life, the electric possibilities of neuroqueerness are unfolding in real time. This slide has an image of a series of clocks on it. So like all narratives, those of the autistic, the autistic trans, hold out the hope of finding sequence and meaning within life's chaos. So in his early work on trans narratives, Jay Prosser argued that 20th century transsexuals were drawn to autobiography for precisely that reason, in search of a narrative home to not be so adrift in the world. But Kajia Min points out that if retrospective linearity proves healing for some trans people, then it's at the expense of others whose lives lack the coherence to spin into a chrononormative story. Chrononormativity being Elizabeth Freeman's term for the use of normative time to achieve maximum productivity. So Min implies that in trans life, to amplify the non-chrononormative may be a way of doing justice. And this slide has an image of the front cover of the book Trapdoor. In their book Trapdoor, Raina Gossett, Eric Stanley, and Joanna Burton write that many doors are currently opening for trans lives, for example, visibility, recognition, citizenship, and that those doors are also traps which harbor a demand to suitably orient oneself towards capital and national priorities, productivity, wealth, accumulation, in exchange for belonging. So one of the costs for seeking that belonging is demand for normativity, or an incitement to able-mindedness, we might say. So the requirement of trans citizenship could be phrased this way, that we are permitted to have a wrong body on the condition that it be inhabited by a right mind. But when Gossett, Stanley, and Burton write that the doors currently opening for trans people are traps, they point out there are also trans trap doors through which another life becomes possible, through which we might escape. So I'm suggesting that inside the narratives of autistic trans life, there might be a trapdoor that would take us towards what Alison Kafer calls an elsewhere or an elsewhen. And this slide has an image of an hourglass tipping over. From the beginning of Leo Kanner's 1943 identification of autistic children, the assumed wrongness of their tempo saturated his assessment of them as, quote, repetitive and ritualistic. And of course, you need only look at the DSM to see that the terms repetitive and ritualistic can also apply to psychiatry. But in any case, we can note that the symptoms that currently make up the autism diagnosis in the DSM-5 primarily refer to temporal misdemeanors. So criterion A includes so-called failures of reciprocity, such as the length of eye contact or normal back and forth conversation. And criterion B is concerned with fixedness of interests, quote, abnormal in intensity and focus, as well as repetition and adherence to routines or ritualized patterns. And nonetheless, Laura Kate Dale points to an unlisted criterion that she says always precedes diagnosis, which is having become a disruption to others. So in Nora, despite that, in Noah Adams and Bridget Liang's interview with a mixed race autistic trans man, Raynard, the temporality of disruption itself also seems to be racialized, with Raynard only interpreted as loud and aggressive when he's in white spaces. And for all the diagnostic concern over autistic intensity and repetition, its punishment is no less intense and repetitive. So Sparrow writes that the most consistent experience across their lifetime has been bullying, while Dale writes that peer shunning forced her to grow up before her time. And this slide has an image of a drop of water. And despite this, the possibility of celebrating autistic temporalities also radiates out from the writing of autistic people. So the consuming passion of an interest, the concentrated pleasure of a stim, the uncontainable joy of a flap or twirl. Stacey Eason remarks on the autistic delight of categorization and list making, while Julia Miel Rodas calls the ricochet of echolalia nothing short of poetic. Sparrow gestures to the joy of suspended time that's possible in autistic focus, asking, have you ever spent half the day lost in the beauty of how water moves? Refusing the temporality of treatment, meaning the temporality of getting better, autistic editor Julia Bascom simply states, we are fine. And while early autistic autobiographers like Temple Grandin once celebrated their emergence out of autism, others like Dawn Prince Hughes have since narrated their emergence into autism, into its beauty, she writes. Oh, I think I skipped, yep. So while not all trans people or all autistic trans people desire medical transition, many do, and narrative is key to its achievement. Jay Prosser writes about the need to story oneself during clinical assessment. He writes, there has probably never been so much at stake in oral autobiography. Tell the story persuasively and you're likely to get your hormones and your surgery, falter, repeat, disorder, omit, digress, and you've pretty much had it. Elizabeth Freeman writes that in psychiatry and medicine, having a life entails the ability to narrate it. So in this paper, I'm arguing that the narratives of autistic trans authors generate their own temporalities by scrambling transgenders' narratives in three ways: by insisting on autism and gender variance as mutually inclusive, by foregrounding alternative sensor realities, and by interrupting the able-minded future and the mandate to get better. And for the sake of time, I'm only discussing the third point. So within chrononormative trans narratives, transition represents a step on the happy ending escalator. So once described to me by a child psychologist who worked with trans youth as, quote, assessment, diagnosis, treatment, happy person. So while the history of trans medicine is riddled with pathology and pity and disorder and doom, this is now less often the case. We might interpret the banning of conversion therapy in some jurisdictions to mean that trans can now have a future of sorts. Yet very tellingly, applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, which is also known by some as autistic conversion therapy, still remains the gold standard in autism treatment, certainly in my province, in Canada at least. And this is an image of a new paper of mine that looks at together at conversion therapy and autistic applied behavioral analysis treatment, ABA. So when psychologist Diane Ehrensaft writes about, quote, double helix rainbow kids, by which she means youth who are both autistic and trans, she recalls one autistic trans youth who received trans positive care and then returned to wow their clinicians. So this is a quotation. The clinic team was astounded to discover a child who strode into the clinic, shook hands with the team, made eye contact, and began talking in full, although truncated sentences, end quote. So Ehrensaft is suggesting here that trans-positive care might make an autistic trans person, quote, get better. So she asks, could gender be, this is her quote again, could gender be an alleviator for some of the stressors of autism And if the answer to that turned out to be yes, that would not be bad. But autistic authors remind us that to appear to be normate is not evidence of health, and the practice of masking to perform neurotypicality for advantage or for survival is not an indicator of wellness. It's an indicator of the need to map your power relations, map the power relations with which you're faced. So when physician Jack Turbin writes that he hopes if autistic trans youth were accepted and treated well, some might turn out to not be autistic at all. He is banking on the trans future being able-bodied and able-minded. And yet, an autistic trans man named Moose, who was interviewed by Adams and Liang, reported that when he transitioned, his autistic symptoms increased rather than decreased. So post-transition, Moose began rocking and stimming more and experiencing more echolalia, while at the same time finding himself more self-confident and less inclined to hide either his trans or his autistic status. Adams and Liang write, although his transition caused him to lose the ability to hide his autistic symptoms, he gained the ability to live without shame. So emerging from self-actualization, Moose appears to be more disabled rather than less, in defiance of a chrononormative account. While Jay Prosser argued that narrative is a trans person's second skin, autistic memoirist Don Prince writes that being autistic is simply being human, but without the skin. So the lack of expected narrative can limit the life chances of autistic trans people and can diminish their potential for legibility, can diminish the skin they have to protect them. The difference also allows for swerving around the trap of transnormativity and towards, in Kafer's words, desirably disabled worlds. So in closing, while Kafer's desire for disability is not yet widely shared, the desire for trans futures has grown exponentially. But as Gossett, Stanley, and Burton point out, many of those futures are traps, concealing a demand to assume normative and neoliberal priorities in exchange for belonging. And I've argued that some of those traps might be undone through autistic disruption, through the narratives of those who, either by choice or by circumstance, defy the chrononormative mandate of the able-minded future, and insist instead on the continuation of what Yorgos refers to as queer tickings toward queer futures. So I will leave it there for now. These are references that people can have access to, if helpful, and thank you very much.